Modern politics, right? It's usually all about budgets, polling data, and endless press conferences. But what if the fate of a government was actually bound by the ancient, inescapable laws of Greek mythology? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of recent commentary from Sky News Australia. It's a striking juxtaposition. On one hand, you've got the daily, modern grind of the Albanese government, and on the other, the dramatic, completely fatalistic worldview of the ancient Greeks. The provocative case being made by the source is that our current political landscape isn't just dealing with standard policy shifts. No, it's actively playing out according to ancient, universal laws of downfall. So let's jump right in and examine exactly how classical mythology is being mapped onto today's political headlines. So here is the roadmap of this ancient law we'll be looking at. First, the cycle of downfall. Then, stage 1, Hubris, followed by stage 2, Atis, and finally, Nemesis and Thesis. All right, section 1, the cycle of downfall, ancient laws and modern predictions. To build this critique, the commentator draws directly on a blog post from a site called GreeceHighDefin.com, arguing that the Albanese government is currently moving through 4 chronological stages of classical downfall. You see, the ancient Greeks firmly believed that arrogant human actions trigger an ironclad response from the divine. It's not just a random string of bad luck. They saw it as an absolute certainty. First comes hubris, which is the initial offense. Then Atis, a state of mental delusion. That is inevitably followed by nemesis, the agent of retribution, and the whole thing concludes with tripsis, total destruction. The Sky News broadcast applies this ancient blueprint directly to the current Australian political climate, suggesting that the government has already set this unavoidable train in motion. Moving right along to Section 2, Stage 1, Hubris, the initial offense. Quoting directly from the blog, the host establishes hubris as something far beyond standard arrogance. It's an extreme overestimation of one's power, abilities, or status, often challenging the gods, state laws, or society's moral code. It's an excessive attempt to transcend mortal limits. The commentary makes a really specific point to distinguish this from your everyday political confidence. A government committing hubris believes it can act completely without consequence. They operate as if they are literally immune to the judgment of the fates. It's an action that completely disrupts the fundamental balance of society or nature. And it is exactly this extreme brand of arrogance that the broadcast claims to see in the current administration. To back this up, the commentator groups some very disparate political actions together, arguing they represent the government recklessly playing God and, as a result, inviting divine retribution. First, the recognition of a Palestinian state. The source frames this not merely as a policy choice, but as an arrogant challenge to historical accuracy. Second, the government's climate change agenda. The argument presented here is that trying to change the weather by building massive infrastructure, things like transmission towers and windmills, is a literal attempt to play God. Third, on a more personal level, Minister Chris Bowen's reported travel expenses, which exceed $1 million, are pointed to as an act of profound personal arrogance. Finally, and the commentator actually calls this the greatest act of hubris, is the government's recent maneuvers on capital gains and negative gearing, especially after promising repeatedly not to touch them. It turns out reversing tax promises isn't just bad for the polls. According to this specific framework, it's an absolute insult to the gods. Okay, let's look at what comes next in Section 3. Stage 2, 8, delusion and clouded reason. So once the initial offense of hubris disrupts the balance, the gods, who are often led by Zeus in the mythology, send Atea upon the transgressor. Atea is defined as a state of severe mental blindness or delusion. Basically, the offender loses their ability to reason clearly. They continue marching down a completely reckless path, totally oblivious to the massive danger right in front of them, which of course leads to even further errors. The broadcast frames the government's recent policy pivots not as simple political strategy, but as an active, real-time manifestation of this exact mythological delusion. And the commentator points to a very stark contrast to illustrate this concept of an Atis, comparing the government's previous election promises directly with their recent admissions. Attention is heavily drawn to the absolute refusal of politicians to acknowledge their prior definitive statements. When confronted by journalists with past assurances where changes to negative gearing were categorically ruled out, the response is no longer a defensive policy. Instead, it's a blunt pivot. To the commentator, this inability to reconcile past promises with current actions isn't just your standard political spin. Within this Greek framework, it is literal evidence of clouded reason. It's the mental blindness of a Nante playing out live on national television.
by presenting a rapid-fire montage of politicians repeating this exact phrase. The broadcast attempts to visually and audibly demonstrate this mental blindness in action. The commentary plays a string of clips where government officials, when pressed on their broken promises, repeatedly fall back on this single robotic line: "We've changed our position." This repetition is used strategically to hammer home the idea of "are it." It frames the politicians as being in a state of self-delusion, blindly repeating a talking point, while completely ignoring the political danger and the massive loss of public trust that such a stark reversal creates.
This brings us to Section 4, Nemesis and Tenesis, the final stages of retribution. Having established the offense and the delusion, the commentary moves on to the unavoidable consequences. Because after hubris and after the blindness of Atis, a person's fate is sealed. Enter Nemesis. Nemesis is the goddess whose specific job is to dish out divine retribution. The commentator makes a really interesting comparison here, noting that Nemesis is essentially the ancient Greek version of karma. Because the initial act of hubris upset the natural balance, Nemesis acts as the necessary balancing force, a reaction to the action. And the stark warning here is that this force of political karma is already gathering major momentum. The commentator playfully wonders aloud who this nemesis might actually be in modern Australian politics. In the broadcast, an audio clip of politician Pauline Hanson is played, declaring that her supporters will no longer be the forgotten people and mentioning one nation. By inserting this clip right after defining the goddess of retribution, a subtle suggestion is made that right-wing populist movements, or perhaps just the broader voting public who feels sidelined, will act as the modern-day nemesis. They are positioned perfectly as the cosmic balancing force arriving to exact political vengeance for perceived arrogance. Ultimately, the claim is that this final stage is the government's guaranteed destiny. This is Thropsis, the end of the line. The cycle is completely finished. Thropsis isn't just a slap on the wrist. It is defined as total destruction and a catastrophic end for the offender. The explicit prediction laid out by the source is that because the Albanese government has committed hubris and is currently suffering from the blindness of Et, they are hurtling inevitably towards Thropsis. In practical, modern terms, this destruction is defined by the broadcast as complete humiliation and defeat at the ballot box in the upcoming federal election. The argument concludes with the ultimate cautionary tale, the myth of Icarus. The ancient Greeks didn't view hubris as just a personal character flaw. They viewed it as a universal law of physics for human behavior. Basically, you cannot challenge the natural and divine order without paying the price. Just ask Icarus, right? Wearing wings of wax, he arrogantly ignored warnings and flew way too close to the sun, which led to his fatal plunge into the sea. This iconic myth is used to put a final, highly dramatic punctuation mark on the commentator's prediction for the government's trajectory. As we wrap up this explainer, we have to ask ourselves, does classical Greek philosophy truly hold the blueprint for modern political cycles? The source material makes a compelling, highly structured argument that the missteps of a modern government map perfectly onto an ancient timeline of downfall. From policy reversals to perceived arrogance, it frames every single political headline as a step toward unavoidable electoral destruction. But is politics truly bound by the immutable laws of mythology, or is this just a deeply creative way to analyze a struggling administration? That is the fascinating question you should take away from this. Keep a close eye on the headlines and see if you can spot the cycle playing out for yourself.